Hello. Okay, so I'm going to be going through the study guide piece by piece so as to help you to study for the test. We're going to go ahead and start off with theories of origin. This is the origin of the state, the sort of ideas of where the government came from. The first theory is force theory, which is essentially strong citizens in a society. The strong created the government to control the weak. Essentially, like this idea that we use force to exert our will and to control other people. This is most compatible with dictatorships. If you think about it, the idea that government exists for strong people to control weak people and exerting force over them really fits well with the idea of a dictatorship, one person being in charge of a country and sort of controlling everyone else in it. Divine right theory, this idea sort of goes along with monarchies. The idea is the right to rule comes from God. So this is not only within Christian societies, late European kings thought that they had a right to rule from God, but also the Chinese had this thing called the mandate of heaven, which is this idea that their gods were deciding who was fit to rule and who wasn't. So this is most compatible with monarchy. You'll remember monarchy people inherit the throne from usually their father. That's sort of like it's tied to a bloodline because God chose that family. Evolutionary theory, we evolved and created, well, that's not a good explanation for it. Hold on just a second. Okay, sorry about that. The idea behind evolutionary theory is that early tribal societies formed governments that controlled the rest of the population. And then lastly, social contract theory, which is most compatible with democracy. This is the idea that people receive right to rule, or governments receive the right to rule from the governed. The idea here being that, for example, the United States government only has power because the people give it power. When the people stop giving it power, the government stops having a right to rule. They become illegitimate. That doesn't mean like, oh, I don't like the government, so I'm not going to listen to them. It's more like what happened with the American Revolution. They thought that the government at the time was wrong, and so they stopped obeying the laws and went to war with them. So that's sort of what it looks like. Okay, so let's talk about who's in charge. In democracy, the people are in charge. Okay, democracy, demos. So demos means people. That's what we've got here. Democracy has the people in charge. They rule by voting, and that's sort of how we control our government. That's what we've got in America. Dictatorship, one person in charge. Okay, so dictatorships are when there's a person who is usually supported by the military that kind of rules with an iron fist. And they oversee all of society, and they don't really report to anyone in the government. They just kind of do whatever they want. Oligarchy, small group is in charge. This is a lot like a dictatorship, except instead of one single person in an oligarchy, or in a dictatorship, in an oligarchy you've got a small group. So a good example of this is the Soviet Union during the Cold War. They were controlled by the Communist Party, and there was one person at the head, but in general, the Communist Party controlled the country. Okay, monarchy. One person who inherits the right to rule from the previous ruler, usually by birth. Okay, so with this is usually a king or a queen. And what it is I, like in England, I don't know why I'm saving. Sorry about that. You like in England, where you've got Queen Elizabeth II right now, her son Charles is going to become the king when she passes away, and then his son William, and so on and so forth. This is kind of like a dictatorship, but you can have monarchies where one person is inheriting the throne that are also constitutional and have elements of democracy. But with monarchy, what you've got to remember is that it's about inheritance, and it's usually from birth. And then autocracy is one person completely controls the government entirely. This is a little bit different than a dictatorship in the sense that it is very, very, very rigid, and there's one person that calls all the shots, and if you disagree with them, you die. This is sort of a new form of government that we've seen that has come out because in the age of totalitarianism, and so the government is completely controlled by one person. Okay, so let's talk about the geographic distribution of power. So. And for this, if you can hold on just a second, I'm going to pull up a map. Maybe. Okay, I've got a map. Okay, so this is kind of a crappy map, so sorry about that. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to use this to demonstrate the different ideas. Okay, so first, let's talk about what happens in a unitary government. Say the United States was a unitary government. You've got this entire country, and everything that we did would be controlled out of the national government, which is located here in Washington, D.C. Okay, Washington, D.C. is right about there. Every single decision would come out of our national government. We don't have a unitary government, just so that we're clear. The United States does not have a unitary government. If we did, every decision in government would be made here. Switzerland is a good example of a country that has a unitary government. They have one country. Every single decision is made by voting. The entire population makes a vote on every single decision that needs to be made. Every single decision happens at the national level. This is where our national government is located. So if we were unitary, the whole of the United States would be controlled by Washington, D.C. What a unitary government means that a country is controlled entirely by one national government, and there are not local governments. Okay. A federal government is a government like ours. Ours is a federal government where most of the power is concentrated in Washington, D.C., or in the capital of the country. And then the local governments, the state of Kansas, the state of Missouri, the state of Texas, the state of Nevada, are all controlled by individual state governments that then are overseen by the federal government. So there's a power out here, but then it's concentrated. It sort of concentrates here, and this government oversees everyone else. More power is given to the national government than to the state governments. The national government overrules the state governments. Okay. The last kind of system is confederate system. Okay, so let me go ahead and write these out for you real quick. One central government controls the whole country. Let me not bold that. National government controls oversees the running of state governments. Okay, and am I taking too long? I am taking too long. Okay, confederate. Confederate government is a government where all of the power, most of the power is concentrated in the states. So each state government is more powerful, and then the national government oversees it. Okay, so that's sort of the way that works. All right, I'm going to try to breeze through this real quick because I am taking a very long time. Branches of government. What you need to know here is that in a presidential branch, the executive and the legislative are separate. Okay. For parliamentary, what you need to know is legislative chooses the executive. So like in a presidential government like ours, the president is voted for by the voters, and then Congress passes laws that they run by the president or whatever. Okay, so that's what happens in our government, which is presidential. In a parliamentary government, the voters vote for the parliament or whatever, and then they choose. The parliament then chooses the prime minister, who is then runs the executive branch. Here, they're separate. In parliamentary, they are together. The legislative controls the executive. Okay. What you need to do, you need to know a nation versus a state. Nation, more like a culture, common ethnicity, and shared language. State, government that controls a plot of land. Okay, so a good example of this would be the United States. This map is really handy. The United States, our government is based out of Washington D.C., and then and that is where our state is based. So our state is the United States of America, our federal government. That's what our state is. Okay, not to be confused with the states. These are different. It's the same word, but it's a different concept. Okay, so our state is our federal government. A nation would be like Native Americans that live in South Dakota belong to the Native American nation. They have a shared ancestry and a common language and cultural characteristics that make them separate from most white Americans, okay, or black Americans or what have you. Non-Native Americans that live in the United States, they're separate. They're a separate nation because they're a culture, okay. They are still governed by the federal government. Their state is the federal government, but their nation is Native American. The same thing goes for Hawaii. You have people that belong to the Hawaiian nation that live in Hawaii, but who are governed by, again, our federal government. So it's like the difference between a culture and a government. Okay, let's talk about components of the state. Population, because again, a state is a government. So inside of a state, a population are the people who live in a state. Okay, so in the United States, as an example, our population is everyone that lives in the United States. That is in, we'll say, I'm trying to think of a different example. In Italy, the population is everyone that lives in Italy, except for the people who live in the Vatican City, which is a different government. But okay, so the population is anyone who lives inside the regional territory that the government controls. So if you live in the United States, in the land controlled by the United States, you're part of the population of this state. Okay, government. That is just the government that runs it. So the government that controls a state. Okay, so our government is obviously our president, our Congress, and our Supreme Court. Our president is the head of our government. Other places have prime ministers as the head of their government. That's the person that oversees the state. The territory is the land that the government controls. So this is our territory. This is the land that the United States government controls. And then sovereignty is who runs the government. In the United States, the people are the sovereigns. We're the ones that run the government. Okay, so let's just talk about foundations of democracy real quick. You just need to know what these are. Worth of the individual. The individual is worth something. Something has rights. Okay, this is just the idea that people are worth things and that you have to treat them okay. Equality of all persons. Everyone should be able to achieve equality. So, like, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to give you everything that you need, but it does mean that we are going to treat you, give you the same rights under the law. Majority rule, minority rights. A good example of this would be in the United States Constitution. We have the Bill of Rights to protect people from the greater population, because since we vote on things, the majority of the people in our country have a say. So, like, let's say that tomorrow everyone wanted to ban listening to One Direction. Just to use as an example. because we have the Bill of Rights, which says freedom of speech, you can't, or in freedom of press, you can't just ban a band because you don't like it. Okay, so that's majority rule. So the majority votes on things, but law protects the minorities. Majority votes, law protects minorities. Okay, so if you don't have like I think something like a Bill of Rights, there's a question about whether or not it's a real democracy. Okay, necessity of compromise. You'll think about this during the Constitutional Convention. People disagree and have to compromise to work together. So anytime that like say that I want the city to make say I want the city to buy to put in light rail or like buses. Like let's say I'm really want buses, and we lobby really hard and we're about to get buses installed, but there's someone else that is really concerned about how we're going to pay for the buses, so in exchange we end up raising taxes. I really just wanted the buses. Like I would have probably been okay with I don't know, getting rid of something else and paying for the buses, but this other person wants us to be able to pay for it, so we have to compromise. Okay. Individual freedom. Individuals have freedom. This is the Bill of Rights. Freedom of speech, religion, etc. Okay. Free enterprise. The idea behind free enterprise is essentially that we have a capitalist economy in the U.S. and people are free to make economic decisions. So basically, this is the same thing as consumer sovereignty inside of capitalism, but you can spend your money on whatever you want to spend your money on. Okay, basic concepts of government. A representative government. This is a government that has people. People are represented by people they vote for. So when Congress votes on laws, we don't all vote on laws, but the people that we voted for vote on the laws for us. So that's a representative government. Limited government. Government is ruled by law. This is the idea of the Bill of Rights. Even though the government has power over you and the things that you can do, you've got certain rights that it can't take away. That limits the government and limits what the government can do. Ordered government. Government is organized. All that means is the government is organized and there's a certain way of that things go. Okay. Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is the limited the power of the king and expanded the power of the nobleman. The Petition of Right, right to trial by jury. These were the three English documents you'll remember. And the English Bill of Rights limited the power of the king further. I'm a little bit rusty on those right now, so when you watch this video, come ask me and we'll go over that together. Weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. You just need to know this. Could not control the states. And it could not control the states. Had trouble, or could not tax, so could not pay for government. Okay, so, and then, could not put down Shays' rebellion, so prompted constitutional convention. Okay. Okay, so colonial meetings. The First Continental Congress, they were really mad about the taxes, so they sent the Declaration of Rights to the king. They were like, hey, we want you to stop taxing us, and here's a list of the rights that we think that we have, and then they boycotted Britain. Okay, so all they did was they wrote a document, and telling the king that they were mad. That's all they did with the First Continental Congress. That was just because of the taxes. They got together, were really angry at the king. They wrote a letter telling the king they were angry, and then they boycotted Britain, which meant that they stopped buying British goods. Okay, Second Continental Congress. This is the big difference. Okay, the Second Continental Congress meets after the Declaration of Rights doesn't do anything and the boycott isn't working. So the Second Continental Congress meets, they declare independence. Okay, so the Second Continental Congress declares independence. They say, you know what, we're mad, we're not going to take this anymore, we're a separate country, we're declaring independence. Okay. Constitutional Convention meets to fix the Articles of Confederation, and then what they end up doing instead, they create a new form of government. Okay, so the Constitutional Convention wants to fix the Articles of Confederation. They meet to do that, and instead they end up drafting the Constitution. Okay, Declaration of Independence. Why was it created? Colonists were mad because they felt the British king was trampling on their rights. Wanted to be a new country. Okay, power. Where does power come from? In the Declaration of Independence, power comes from the people. Okay, you'll remember the governed received power from consent of the governed. This is social contract theory again. Okay, so state constitutions. Let's skip this and come back to it real quick. First, let's talk about the Constitution. Virginia Plan. This is the Constitutional Convention. You'll remember they get together in that house and they're like, we're gonna write a new government. And then there are a couple of different proposals here. The Virginia Plan supports larger states, creates Congress based on population. This is the idea that states are represented based on their population. This obviously favors larger states because the larger a population the state has, the more representatives it's going to have in Congress. New Jersey Plan, equal representation for equal states. Okay, this is the idea that each state gets its own vote, gets one vote, or in our case, 2 votes, but the representation is equal across the states. Hold on. What we end up having is we've got a bunch of different arguments going on, and we end up with 3 major compromises that you need to know. Connecticut Compromise, which is also known as the Great Compromise, takes the Virginia and the New Jersey plans and combines them. 2 houses of Congress, one with equal rep for each state, one with rep based on population. Okay, so the idea is that we have 2 houses of Congress, which we do. The House of Representatives is represented based on population. The Senate is represented with equal representation for each state. There are 100 senators, 2 for each of the 50 states. Okay, 3/5 compromise. Slaves count as 3/5 of a person for determining voter population. Okay, so the idea here is that your slave population, even though they weren't technically considered people and that you could own them, so this is kind of hypocritical, but what they end up doing is they say, you know what, we've got all these slaves here, how do they figure into our population? And they decide that they're going to have the slaves count as 3/5 of a person. So 3/5 of all the slaves in a state count towards that state's population. So that you just need to know that that's about the southern states trying to control the country by having their slaves count for population. Okay, the last thing is Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise. This limits the power of the government to end slavery. The idea behind the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise is that the Southerners were concerned that once the Constitution is ratified, the Northern states would vote to end slavery. They didn't want to have that happen, so they wrote the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise into the Constitution. And when they did that, it ended up making it so that the Constitution that you couldn't write slavery out of the Constitution until a certain number of years after the Constitution was created. They limited their ability to get rid of it. So, okay. Let's go back to state constitutions. State constitutions were drafted during independence. I don't really know what I meant by drafting, so again, see me about that, and we'll talk about it. And then there are a couple of common features. Popular sovereignty. People rule their own government. Okay, so popular sovereignty is the idea that the power rests with the people, and they are the ones that are in charge. Okay, limited government. Government is limited by law. These are the same ideas that are present before in democracy. Separation of powers. The idea behind the separation of powers is different branches of government with its own power, with its own responsibilities. So this is executive, legislative, judicial. It's the separate powers that we've got under the Constitution. The state governments also do that. Civil rights and liberties. People have civil rights. That's what you need to know. Protected by constitutions. So these are things like freedom of speech, freedom from persecution, stuff like that. So, okay, this is what I've got for you. So I know that this was a really long video, but I appreciate you for bearing with me. Come see me if you've got any questions, which you should, since I told you to come see me because of stuff that I was kind of vague on. If you have any other problems, just let me know.